Hello everyone, and welcome to Critical Hit, a series where I examine the combat design in games. Namely, player-enemy dynamics, how gameplay and player input interact with the game's enemies, and how the enemy design in turn responds to the player. For this particular video, we'll be taking a look at the evolution of combat design in the original Metroid quadrilogy. Also, this is part of a series of 5 videos I've done on the Metroid quadrilogy, so I recommend watching those other videos first, as they cover aspects of the games I'll most likely either be ignoring or abridging during this video. So, yeah, links in the thingamajig and the whatchamadoo. Also, I may or may not end up reiterating points I've made previously, but that shouldn't be much of an issue if you've not watched the rest. Well, let's get to it. My philosophy when it comes to critiquing combat mechanics in games is that if they exist, they ought to be critiqued, with no regard to what the focus of the game actually is. Good combat doesn't have to be action, cinematic. Good combat can exist in just about any genre imaginable, so when people try to use a game's genre as an excuse for bad combat design, it just strikes me as making excuses. A flaw's a flaw, and the developers should take steps to learn from them. I figured the Metroid quadrilogy would be the perfect candidate for those, both because I wanted to talk about those games anyway, and because they showcase a substantial amount of growth over the course of the series. For better and worse. The combat in Metroid 1 is remarkably bad, despite its fairly decent foundation. A staple foundation of a lot of Nintendo games in the NES era was simple gameplay design and combat for their main franchises like Mario and Zelda. Mario's signature jump doubles as an attack and rewards landing a hit with an extended jump. Zelda with its sword pokes, which are pretty self-explanatory. And honestly, Metroid is no different. The combat mechanics are simple. You jump, you shoot, turn into a ball for evasive measures, and aim in 3 directions. Pretty standard affair for a shooter on the NES, but Metroid tries to set itself apart with a focus on exploration. Though, that's not really a huge factor in regards to the function of combat. Samus gets a few bells and whistles, most notably missiles and bombs, but nothing that really shakes up the foundation of the combat design. For the end user, it's certainly functional, if not a bit clunky. No, the biggest problem with the combat in Metroid 1 is the enemy design. Most of these issues are a result of poor difficulty scaling and, more importantly, mishandled enemy placement. The most immediate example is the Zoomer, the very first enemy you encounter in the game. This enemy is designed for placement on walls, an obstacle for navigation, but for some stupid reason most rooms place them on the floor where you're unable to hit them. Why can't you hit them? Because you can't crouch. There are a few ways this particular example could be dealt with, either implementing a crouch feature, or simply just avoiding placing the enemies in a place where it's impossible to aim at them. Fortunately, this enemy isn't too difficult to deal with on its own, since they're one of the few passive enemies in this entry, but they're often paired alongside enemies that can approach from other angles. While this is the most immediate example, this problem for enemy placement permeates through the entire experience, and when that's combined with the obnoxious difficulty curve, not helped at all by enemies that are capable of hitting you while you're defenselessly going through doors, it makes for, by far, the most frustrating combat design in the Metroid series. I'd touch on the boss design typically as well, but for this particular entry, and if you watched the Metroid 1 critique you'll already know this, I just couldn't be bothered to get far enough in the game to face them. To put it bluntly, the enemy placement and the difficulty curve don't mesh well with the exploration-based games, especially when said difficulty is a result of unfair bullshit rather than an actual challenge. Thankfully, the second game fixes a lot of the issues I have with Metroid 1 combat design. Samus is a lot tankier, or the enemies are less damaging. Crouching has been added to eliminate the impossible enemy targeting dilemma that the Zoomer-type enemies suffered from, and Samus is capable of aiming down while in the air, making combat encounters when descending down shafts less of a frustrating gamble as to whether or not you'll actually be able to avoid being hit. Enemy placement is actually a lot more thoughtful in this game as well. Even when there are multiple enemies on screen, you'll rarely find yourself getting blindsided, and gone are the clipping issues that allowed enemies to attack you when you're passing through doors and unable to defend yourself. Additionally, the existing difficulty curve is gradual on both the enemy and boss front, a trait that would be carried over into every subsequent entry in the series, as opposed to the beat-your-head-against-a-wall approach to difficulty that the first game had. The game does a good job at indicating when an enemy isn't taking damage via audio cues and visual communication. Enemies in the early game can generally be relied upon to take damage from pretty much anything, and in the late game enemies, they gradually gain more visible plating, which can clue you into attacking in different ways, be it missiles, exploiting an opening, or what have you. The most prominent example that comes to mind among the normal enemies are the Moto and the Halzine, the former being a front-facing plate, so the only way to damage it is to either attack it from behind or shoot a missile at its face, or the Halzine, on the other hand, which shields itself on both the left and right side of its body, so you can only reliably hit it from the top or bottom. It tests the player's spatial awareness and their ability to adapt to different situations as they progress further into the game. And this, of course, isn't even touching on the boss fights. Metroid 2 has a total of 6 boss types, 5 of which are Metroids, and apart from the final form, they're all fought multiple times. A rather genius move on part of the developers, since the Metroids aren't so difficult that fighting several in a row before healing properly is undoable. And it allows you, the player, to refine your skill as the game gradually rolls out the new forms. That said, I suppose the best place to start is with the Metroids. Alpha Metroids are pretty simple, as they should be. They introduce the concept of missile vulnerability, as they deflect your normal beam attacks with an audible plink, which will hopefully indicate to the player that they need to change their tactics. An unfortunate design decision, perhaps, is that all the Metroid bosses are basically just programmed to make a beeline for the player. So, in the case of the first alpha, if you're unable to figure out its weakness to missiles, or how to activate missiles, it's quite possible you'll die in this situation. I didn't have this problem, being a longtime fan of the series, but for a newcomer, I could see this being a possible issue. Gammas are a nice extension of the alpha design to ramp up the difficulty. Just like the alphas, you can hit them anywhere in the body with a missile to damage them, but spatial awareness is made far more important, as gammas take up more of the screen, as well as soak up more damage. Additionally, they deal more damage and they possess an electric beam attack that is capable of deflecting missiles, making timing more important. Arguably the biggest design flaw with the Alphas and Gamma Metroids is the beeline attack pattern that they follow, since it's easily exploitable by getting them caught on ledges. But it could have been deliberate to allow the player to feel more semblance of control during their combat encounters. Zetas and Omegas are a different beast altogether. The Zetas are closer in size to the Alphas, but with far more firepower than their Gamma predecessors. Zetas are a bit of an oddity. I like them, and the later Omegas, in theory. Both employ different attacks and movement patterns than the first two stages. They both sport a new weak point, only being able to hit by missiles coming from the front or back, so attacking vertically is no longer a viable tactic, removing the ledge technique that I mentioned earlier. Typically, they'll hover in the air and occasionally swoop down to attack you physically, or they'll spit fireballs at you from the air. If there were a more consistent timing for these, it could be fantastic, but as it stands, it's weird. They still maintain the design of leaving the pace of the battle to the player's initiative, but damage is pretty much unavoidable due to their erratic movement patterns. I'd be lying if I said I didn't like these erratic attributes about the Metroids, though, as it does raise the level of tension for this horror-esque atmosphere that the game is trying to invoke. And they're never unfair. But I guess that doesn't change that they aren't super well-designed combat encounters. I'd say their best attribute is how they keep the flow of combat in the hands of the player rather than making it about when a boss reveals its weak point. The only boss in the game that I'm not fond of is Arachna, the only non-Metroid boss in the game, ironically, who can pretty much only be reliably killed with morph ball bombs. It's not well communicated. Morph bombs aren't typically implemented in combat for Metroid games, so it just comes across as obtuse. Much as I appreciate the variety, I don't think that'll make up for bad design in this case. The final boss, the Queen Metroid, suffers from a similar issue where the best method to kill her is morph ball bombs, but only if you roll down her throat and drop them in her stomach. I'm honestly not sure how anyone would be expected to do this without prior knowledge about the fight through either Nintendo Power, Internet, or word of mouth. Fortunately, missiling the Queen to death is still a doable strategy, so it's not a major hang-up by any stretch like Arachna. Overall, I'd say Metroid 2 enemies and bosses work well. They're never unfair for the most part, but they're still not particularly well designed. It's a huge improvement over Metroid 1 on pretty much every front, to be sure, and it more or less set the standard for enemy design for all the entries that came after. So from this point forward with the analysis, I'm only going to be covering bosses for the next 2 games. So, Super Metroid. Not gonna lie, I don't care for the bosses in Super for the most part. This is largely a personal thing, but there is some objectivity in there that I'll try to pry out for your entertainment. This game definitely keeps things varied, though, for better and worse. This game, not counting the initial supposed-to-lose boss fight, has a total of 10 bosses. I'm going to talk about the Torres and the Gold Torres at the same time, since they're pretty similar to one another, and Mother Brain will be ignored altogether. Much as I think the Mother Brain fight is actually good as a climax of the story, the first phase is basically just avoiding obstacles and little else, while the second phase is just storytelling through gameplay. It's good from a narrative perspective, but it doesn't present any interesting challenge that's worth talking about here. And we're not here to talk about narrative. And now that we've got that cleared up, let's dive right in. Since I said we'd be talking about the Torres later, let's start with the Spore Spawn. This is probably my least favorite boss in the entire game. It represents nothing, and on the gameplay front, it's pretty much just a waiting game. Sit on your ass waiting for it to expose its weak point, unload missiles into its various orifices, rinse and repeat till victory. It offers no challenge, and it robs the player of their agency by forcing them to wait. There are ways to handle a waiting game boss as well, but they sure as hell ain't doing it in this series. Well, not often anyway. As it stands, Spore Spawner is just plain garbage. Sprite work is nice though. Honestly, Kraid's not much better. It's certainly a spectacle, and thankfully it keeps the boss weak point exposure within the power of the player's agency, but it's just a bit tedious. To expose the weak point, you first have to shoot it in the eye, wait for it to open its mouth, and fire missiles into it. That's all there is to it, and it's not too bad, honestly, but this is where the subjectivity comes in. It has a claw attack it occasionally likes to use that gets in the way of your missiles while you're firing into Kraid's mouth, and it's usually just long enough for you to miss your attack window. This isn't a difficult boss by any stretch, but I suppose I'd label it as annoying. Crocomire, on the other hand, is a lot more fun. It still requires you to shoot missiles and whatnot into its mouth, but rather than a battle of damage, it's a tug-of-war where both you and Crocomire try to push each other towards their demise. The premise works great. It's admittedly a bit simplistic, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. One might accuse the boss of not getting more challenging the closer it gets to death as a result, but it kinda does, superficially. The only notable change that I saw was the frequency by which it attacks and how long its weak point remains open. Plus, I might be kinda biased because of the way the fight ends, which is just beautiful. Next up is Phantoon, and if nothing else, I'd say it's yet another step up from the shit show that is the Spore Spawn. It's still a waiting game like Spore, but its pace is a lot more involved. Unfortunately, the vulnerability is determined by the boss rather than the player, so it's difficult to say how much of an improvement this actually is. I'd say that the fight is definitely more interesting than Spore, however, seeing how it has a more varied attack pattern than doing a figure 8 and raining spores traveling along the exact same pattern constantly. If nothing else, it's a more memorable fight, if only for its location and the yokai-isms. It's an okay fight. Of the bosses we've covered in Super, it's definitely top 2. Probably. Botwoon is forgettable. I have nothing to say on it. I'm honestly not sure why I didn't exclude this when I was going over the qualifiers earlier. Or even doing so retroactively. I hope you like Whack-A-Mole! Dragan is also complete garbage. It's either a tedious fight where you try to unload missiles into its weak point of its stomach while it's visible, or let it carry you high enough so that you can grapple beam onto exposed wiring. It's just a bad fight, there's no two ways about it. The grapple beam weakness also suffers from the same problem as the Metroid 2 Queen in that it's obtuse. And apart from accidentally discovering it or using a guide or the internet, I can't really think of how any player could arrive at this overpowered solution to this otherwise dull fight. But I guess I gotta give it credit, the grapple beam shock is enough to make the fight memorable, even if it's otherwise poorly designed. Torres. Have I been saying that right? Yeah, I like these bosses, though I think they work better as a ploy to subvert player expectations for Chozo statues than they work as actual boss fights. The fact that they actually do work as good boss fights is just icing on the cake. The first Torres fight is actually pretty easy, for better or worse. It can be easily taken out with missiles. It's fairly forgiving in that if its attacks hit you, it will leap back and give you more breathing room. And if you don't realize that you can simply roll under it, it fires a series of projectiles that drop healing items and ammo. It's a nice, comfortable challenge for the early game. The second Torizo, or Gold Torizo as it is known, is probably the best boss fight in the entire game on a technical level. I'm partial towards Crocomire still, but objectively speaking, this fight is definitely better. It isn't a waiting game like many of the bosses in this game, and it really pushes your abilities to their limit without seeming unfair. What sets this boss apart is how it adapts to your strategies. Initially, you can hurt it with regular missiles, which it quickly learns to deflect and evade. It'll grab your super missiles out of the air and throw them back at you, leaving the charge beam as your only dependable method of attack. Honestly, the only thing holding this boss fight back is the scythe move that doesn't seem to work in tandem with the in-game physics. You either jump over all of them and don't attack, or morph ball hop around them and also don't attack. Shame really, it's a blemish on an otherwise great fight. Now, Ridley. Oh, I know you've all been waiting to hear my thoughts on this, and I gotta be honest, I don't like the 2D Ridley fights very much, design-wise. Outside of Samus Returns, they're all typically just borderline static sprites tweening around the screen at random, with the attacks not really correlating to anything the main body is doing. Super Metroid is probably the worst of the bunch as well. It's the epitome of the example. It frequently flies off screen, and it seemingly has no pattern. And it has this untelegraphed grab attack which steals a large chunk of your health for free. It's not good. I'll give it credit on the front that it's not a waiting game like the other main bosses, since you can pump missiles into it from start to finish, but that doesn't help much. It's a real shame too, because the level leading up to it and the mini-boss, the Gold Torizo, are all excellent. Well, I'm pretty sure I pissed off quite a few people with that statement. Quick! Let's leg it to Fusion! Oh, and Fusion is good. It's real good. Good level design, good enemy design, great boss design. I'd argue that it's the best of the official 2D lineup. It's just all around a great game, and I'm happy to get to share the love for these bosses. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, let's get started. First off, our buddy Arachna from Metroid 2 is back. Looking good, man. I see you're actually well designed now. Good for you. Yeah, I like this version of Arachna as a starting boss. It's the first boss to establish that all the bosses in the game are based on some lost component of Samus's power armor. Arachna, if you know anything about him from the first game he appears in, and if you were paying attention to the footage from the Metroid 2 part of the video, you'll know that this guy likes to roll into a ball. So it's pretty obvious what ability this boss is based on. The strategy is actually pretty simple. I don't normally talk about the lead up to a boss, but the fight occurs following a hallway of grabbable ledges which are necessary to progress to the boss. Even the pit that leads to the boss itself has ledges, so when you enter the boss room and you see yet more grabbable ledges, it should be fairly obvious that they'll be a part of the boss fight. The game does kind of beat you over the head with the ledges, which I think is a bit overkill, but it's harmless, and it at least ensures that players are well equipped to deal with the boss. The boss has a total of 3 attacks: a slash, which is designed to get you off the ground and onto a ledge, and a fire spread, which has a similar effect, but with a leftover field hazard to keep you on your toes. Lastly, a roll attack that goes straight into the wall, which is designed to catch wall huggers. If you don't jump over this, you're getting hit, as the attack will knock you down from the wall that you're hanging on. For the first boss of the game, the design is just excellent, and it's already a cut above everything else we've seen in this video so far. This fight is over pretty quick, though, what with it being the first boss, as it's pretty easily down by a barrage of missiles. Or so you'd think. Next, the game introduces the concept of Core X, the true form within every boss in the game that holds the ability. They basically act as an extension of every boss to keep you on your toes, especially if they follow a particularly difficult boss. The actual fights against the cores themselves aren't too difficult generally. At least these hardcore X's, as they're called. They basically just float around trying to ram the player. They can only be damaged with missiles, but they're usually plentiful. And immediately after defeating the boss, they drop several small HP and ammo X, which spawn next to it, which ought to add a nice cushion if you're low on ammo or HP. Additionally, the Core X will expel these smaller refill X if you shoot them with a beam or missile, so they're really not much of an issue. I love the concept, though. It's a brilliant way to contextualize a power-up obtained through a biological life form. Now, on to the next boss, which is yet another Core X, but this is a different variant from the previous one. This one, and the ones later down the line, aren't actually paired with a boss. They're called Beam Core X, which, by the name, should tell you what you need to know. Each Beam Core X wields one of Samus's beams, be it Charge Beam, Wide Beam, Plasma, Wave, or Ice. They're a waiting game type boss, like those I complained about with Super, but they do one thing that makes them fun and bearable. In this case, they reveal their weakness quickly, and they're relatively easy to kill. The strategy with these guys is a bit more interesting than the hardcores, as they have an actual attack beyond just trying to run into Samus. These beam cores are slower, but they'll often open up their membrane to attack Samus with one of their beams, and these openings are their only weak point. They've also got a fairly generous period in which you can hit them while they're charging up the beam. Well, I say charging, but they will fire the beam automatically if you hit their weak point. A rather brilliant design decision considering you'll always be standing right in front of them when you hit them in the weak point. Some might call this cheap, but if you quickly realize that you need to evade immediately after attacking yourself, then it should be no issue. Both Core X variants are pretty legit. Since they're not full-on bosses themselves, I think they do their job pretty damn well. That said, it's time to move on to some actual proper boss fights again. You're all probably wondering, do I actually have all these boss names memorized? The answer is no. Outside of the Prime series, I just about only know Ridley, Kraid, Mother Brain, all the Metroid variants, Crocomire, Torres, Arachna, Saris, Core X, Nightmare, and the SAX. Not sure why I felt like injecting it here, just couldn't find an appropriate time to do so otherwise. That said, next up is Zaza, one of the boss names I had to Google. That's a rather dismissive way to start off this boss description, I suppose, but I actually do find this boss fight enjoyable. This boss is the embodiment of the high jump boots and morph ball jump. It doesn't really have any attacks in the traditional sense, unless the tradition is stomping Goombas. Basically, all this boss does is jump and try to stamp on and eat you. It's an interesting idea, honestly. The only way to hurt it is to shoot up the hole on its underbelly, which puts you directly in the path of its chomps. It creates this risk-reward approach to combat that I really enjoy. If I had any complaints about it, it's that you usually have to wait for it to jump 2 to 3 times before it will open up its weak point. But fortunately, that's only Phase 1. Phase 1 also happens to make it less risky to shoot than the other phases, since it slowly floats down. Once you've done a substantial amount of damage, the boss will actively jump attack you without waiting, with the trade-off of it now falling faster. It's not an overly challenging fight, but for this early in the game, it's still at the level it needs to be, and perhaps more importantly, it's fun and imaginative. Next is Saris. This one is fairly well known among those who fight it, and it even makes a cameo in AM2R apparently, so it's definitely got a foothold in the fan community. Honestly, I'm not a fan of this boss. It could just be that I don't know a better strategy, but it seems to be a little more than just shooting missiles in its face and waiting for it to exit its invincibility state. If I'm doing this wrong, by all means point it out, but as it stands, I just don't find this boss fun or interesting. But it's certainly memorable, a trait shared by all the fusion bosses, so hey, I guess that makes it better than Super! Oh, come on, I like Super, calm down. Now, technically the box security robot is next, but it comes up again later, so once again I'll be moving on to the next boss. The Mega Core X is next. This boss is pretty easy. It's basically the incarnation of the Variasuit, so think of it as a supercharged and supersized Hardcore X. The most interesting thing about this boss is that it's only weak to charge beam shots. Yeah, that's it. This boss is more cool because of its introduction, not much else. Moving on. Yakuza is an odd one. I'm not sure what a giant Japanese gangster spider robot is doing on a research vessel, but I guess it needed to be implemented so the screw attack could be in here. Actually, it's not the screw attack, it's the space jump. This is actually one of the worst bosses in the game, honestly. It's not bad by any stretch, but it is the embodiment of the problems I won't shut up about with super bosses. Phase 1 involves a lot of waiting for it to open its mouth to shoot missiles in it, and once it takes enough damage, its legs break off and it starts to space jump around. I'm honestly not sure what to make of this. This fight isn't particularly fun, and it's not terribly challenging. It doesn't make much sense narratively either. I guess they just couldn't come up with a better excuse to work in the space jump, so it just feels kinda forced. Natori is a lot more interesting in that it's the second corruption of the Chozo statue in this game, fourth if we're counting the Toriso from Super Metroid. If I had to describe this boss, I'd say it's basically the Spore Spawner from Super Metroid with less waiting. The progress in this fight is entirely player-driven. You can unload missiles and do it as much as you want, since it's always vulnerable. The only concern you face as the player is evading the spores coming in from the ceiling. Phase 2 is interesting in that it ditches the spore evasion altogether in favor of plasma beam fire, which kinda gives away what it's based on. Phase 2 is honestly easier than Phase 1, but the fight's not hard. Is it fun? Yeah, kinda. I personally enjoy Phase 2 more than Phase 1, but really the fight is just kinda there. It's not nearly as thrilling as the Gold Torizo from Super, but I guess it's more interesting than a simple, enhanced version of a previous boss. Yeah, this one's fine. I don't really have anywhere else to go with this statement. Moving on. Nightmare. Everyone loves Nightmare, don't they? Well, at least everyone remembers it. I think it's a cool fight, even if the visual design is kinda iffy. But that's more personal taste than anything. The fight itself is a lot of fun. Starts off fairly standard. Figure out the weak point and pump a load of missiles into it. But this boss flips that concept on its head by activating some gravity mechanism that makes your movements slower and heavier. Rather than creating a missile invulnerability, the boss simply makes your missiles so heavy that their propulsion can't hold them up long enough to land a hit. And it's fantastically imaginative. It gets even better in Phase 3, where the gravity warp gets disabled and its weak point changes from the underside to its face. If I had any complaint about the fight, it's that the boss can get pretty difficult to avoid when it starts sporadically flying around the arena. I think it's a bit too large to pull off the erratic movements in a way that feels fair. I didn't like that kind of movement when it was Ridley in his large arena in Super, and it doesn't work well here either. That said, it still really is a fun and creative fight. Now for the box robot I mentioned earlier. I'm honestly not sure which encounter with it I dislike more. This isn't a particularly hard boss, but it does suffer from the waiting game of Super. All fights against this thing involve waiting for it to open its weak point while it attacks, and the only difference between Phase 1 in the early game and Phase 2 in the later half of the game is what attack it uses when it opens up its weak point. Phase 1 drops mortars, which, ironically, are safer when you're positioned directly over them, which can create this interesting dynamic where you're left with a decision to take more risk of damage by dealing more against the boss, or playing it safe and positioning yourself above the mortar. Phase 2 doesn't have this. It now fires missiles, which have wonky collisions, so you might miss your chance to shoot them out of the air by no fault of your own, and the fight now takes place directly over electrified water, so you're punished more heavily for taking damage and falling into the water by no fault of your own. That said, the fight still isn't hard, it's just less interesting than Phase 2. It's not great, I'd say it's fair. And not difficulty fair, it's quality fair. Just wanted to make that clear. Neo Ridley is okay. I'm not sure how it's meant to represent the screw attack. Kinda suffers from the same problem as Yakuza, honestly. The fight itself is alright. It's definitely better than its Super Metroid counterpart, but it kinda has the exact opposite problem of not being particularly challenging. It might just be a limitation of the hardware, but most 2D Ridley fights in the series have been fairly mediocre design-wise for the same reason I gave earlier. Now, the SAX is actually a pretty good fight. This is the climactic battle the game was leading up to, and I think it works fairly well. It basically behaves the way you'd expect Samus to behave. It tries to shoot a beam, and if it jumps, intercept it in the air with a screw attack. What makes this interesting is that you're inferior to the SAX in pure firepower. Even in a screw attack trade, you'll take the damage. So the fight basically turns into a dance of beams and space jumps where you try to outmaneuver one another and land as many hits on one another as you can before the other one defeats you. And I don't think I've seen this concept handled nearly as well in the rest of the series, including the Prime games. At least not to the same extent. Unfortunately, Phase 2 is significantly less interesting, since its attacks basically just involve jumping in the air and screeching at you while you unload charge beams into its face. Overall, it's a pretty good mirror match, and it's a brilliant climax to a brilliant game. And hey! The Omega Metroid is back! Honestly, the Omega in this game isn't all that great. Let it hit you once so you can trigger the story event that lets you regain the Ice Beam, then run back and forth unloading charge beam shots into its torso. The only thing that separates this fight from the others is that it takes place during a self-destruct sequence. And getting hit takes an entire energy tank and grounds you for several seconds, where you're unable to act. It works well in tandem with the timer, but it's not difficult to avoid. Overall, I think it's safe to say Fusion has, at this point, more or less perfected the 2D Metroid formula. This video was more of a showcase of the evolution of combat design that led up to it. I certainly hope you all enjoyed it. Much as I'd love to talk about the later entries, this video is plenty long as it is. As I mentioned at the end of the last video, I don't plan on tackling the other 2D Metroid entries until I'm capable of recording 3DS games. If you enjoyed this video and the rest of the series, make sure to throw me a like and subscribe. If you really love this channel or the series and would like to see the rest of the 2D entries, consider donating to my Patreon. If we hit the $500 goal, I'll be able to buy the 3DS capture hardware that I'll need for Sam's Returns, as well as other 3DS titles I'd love to talk about like Pokemon and Monster Hunter, amongst other things. If we meet the goal, I'll get to work straight away with starting on the rest of the 2D Marathon, which will consist of Zero Mission, Other M, AM2R, and Sam's Returns. And once again, if you're wondering why Other M is on the list, it's because it contains a lot of the same design sensibilities as a 2D entry. If we don't reach the goal, don't sweat it. I've got plenty of other content on the way I'll be working on, and this is mostly a hobby for me right now anyway. I've got a video where I'll look at the world design of the main series Pokemon games. Won't be looking at the individual route design or anything, or the individual games for that matter on their own as of yet, but this is something I've wanted to examine for a while. Additionally, me and a friend of mine will be collabing on a couple of Monster Hunter videos. It'll mostly be console stuff since I can't record 3DS, but hey! It should still be fun, especially on the lead up to Monster Hunter World, if it even comes out before then. I hope you all enjoyed the video, or the series if you sat through all of them. I hope you all have a fantastic night and that this video lit a fire under you.